We need to close.
We're going to do this city. Okay, I'll close the urban renewal work group and open a city council work session for February 18th. We haven't added any new people, on the council, so we'll keep going. Okay.
So I would like
set
to
this up?
turn this over to Councilor Kaiser to introduce the subject, and then I'll move over to the recommendations, the implementation plan.
Well, thank you. Not quite sure what you'd like me to do, but I'm just I'll do a really quick recap and correct me on my dates because I'm not completely sure and I don't have all my notes, but so the mayor, convened the Downtown Homelessness Solutions Task Force. I believe it started up about a year ago. And we had representatives on that. Members of the task force included downtown business owners, social service providers. Councilor Lewis, Councilor Osick were on that task force. And we had members of the community, city staff, and Kristen kind of helped me run it, actually, which I'm really appreciative of. And we met as a group, I think it was 6 times over the course of February through August. We wrapped up in August. And we had good conversations. The scope of the task force was very narrow. It was really to focus on what could we do now to improve the conditions of people experiencing homelessness downtown. And it wasn't more than that. And that's what these recommendations really reflect, is that narrow scope. And we had good conversations. They were difficult. I think the subject matter is difficult. We had a lot of written comments. I think we invited guests. I mean, we kind of went through this whole exercise with a period of about 6 months. And what we came up with is something I'm really proud of. I think it's 8 recommendations or so. And yeah, so that's kind of a really brief recap. I know once we made those recommendations, then staff went back to try to figure out what's the best way to implement these. What are some of our options here to actually do what we're talking about? And that's where we're at tonight.
Great job on chairing this. I sat in on a couple of them, and you just really did an outstanding job, both you and Kristen. Councilor Kaiser, I'm really pleased with the outcome. I think we have some stuff to really work with here. Kristen, are you going to take us through this?
I'm going to take you through them. Yeah, so I'm going to start kind of high and then drill down. Early on through the task force meetings, the group identified 4 main challenges to address that were impacting downtown and needs for the homeless community. So the first one was showers, toilets, laundry, hygiene facilities. The second one was behavioral expectations. Third was a safe environment for everyone. And the fourth was cleaning up garbage and human waste. So all of these recommendations kind of fall under these 4 big challenges. The recommendations that were made kind of fall under three categories of either their facilities type recommendations, their operational recommendations, or their recommendations around communications and relationships. So I'm going to read through the 8 recommendations here, and then we'll start diving into the implementation strategies. So the first one was to provide public toilet facilities that are available 24/7. Second, provide a hygiene center with showers and laundry facilities to serve homeless individuals in the downtown. Third was to establish a good neighbor partnership. So an ongoing organizational structure, and then through that to look at our codes and ordinances and kind of vet any ordinance changes through that structure. 4 was to establish a simplified point of contact and to provide guidance for the community on when to call 911 versus emergency services. 5th was to support development of additional storage for homeless individuals. 6, support alternative ways of giving. 7 is encouraging property owners to build out site modifications to improve security, kind of garbage control, that sort of thing. And then the last one was pursuing options for expanding downtown cleaning services. So since these recommendations were made back in August, we have since, researched each recommendation and developed implementation options. We've looked at these recommendations strategically to look at how we can leverage our existing financial resources or facilities or partnerships. We have amended the downtown urban renewal plan. So as you may recall, back at the end of last year, we passed a minor amendment to that plan to add projects that supported implementation of the city's strategic plan and the task force recommendations. We have developed a new grant program that will be coming to you at your next urban renewal meeting that will support grants to property owners for things like trash enclosures, or if they want to secure or gate off their doorways, or install lighting or other security measures. And we have conducted a few internal meetings between different departments with police, and we've taken it really broad within the city, just kind of beyond urban development and the police, to all city departments to really talk about more global impacts in the community. And we have also developed a who to contact flyer for the 911 or emergency piece. It has not been rolled out yet, but we have that in a draft form at this point. So our next steps will be to go through the implementation options, and then start moving some of these forward through our next budgetary cycle. Some of the recommendations have, from the staff perspective, we've determined them to not be feasible. Most of the ones that we've determined to not be feasible, it's because they're tied to enforcement and they're just not really enforceable. So we'll get to that as we go through the recommendations. And we have, some of these have, some pretty hefty budget or staffing implications. The recommendations, as we'll go through them, are presented in priority order as established by the task force. So as we go through, number one is their top priority. So I'll move right on to those. So the first one, that recommendation, providing public toilet facilities 24/7. So we have a few different options in how we could pursue that one. So that was top priority for businesses, for advocates, for service providers, is that a sense that if there's no place for people to meet basic biological needs, then we can't really expect them to not be taking care of this business downtown. So what can we do to provide some options for them overnight? So some of the background discussion about this was that, we've tried the Arta potties. There were challenges with Arta potties. There were behavioral issues with facilities that if they're not staffed. So all of the recommendations and discussion was about providing facilities, but having them staffed or monitored. So it's not just a funding issue for constructing the facility. There's also an operational issue tied to this. So the primary option would be to partner with an existing service provider to provide that 24/7 access, and work with them in a way that can increase their operational capacity so that there could be staffing or monitoring around the clock. The second option would be to keep restrooms at Marion Park or Riverfront Park open around the clock, but that does create the safety and security issues. So we could open those up. We do not have the capacity to staff them, and we could expect that there would be behavioral issues and policing issues tied to that. The third implementation option would be to keep a part of the new police station when it is open, that there are public restrooms off the lobby, to keep those open for extended hours. And then there could be operational issues there too. You could have extended hours while there's staffing available. 24/7 would have greater staffing impacts. Yes.
So I'm sorry, I'm just always struck by this. So when we talk about the risks of having bathrooms open 24/7, so do other cities just not have behavioral issues? Because other places do seem to have access to facilities. I know we're unique as a city, but I keep coming back to this full circle of, well, it's too risky. But other communities seem to be able to address this issue, so what?
I think other cities have similar challenges, that there will be drug use, there will be drug dealing, there will be prostitution that occurs, and that is the history here. That's what was going on with Arta Potties when we had them in our downtown. We have had issues with fires being set in those kinds of porta potties. So there are challenges, and I think that any community experiences to some degree or another those types of challenges.
Thank you.
So then it's just a question of, do we want to build it knowing that there will be policing issues? And then feedback that I've received also from other communities and from some of our service providers is that if there is a location that becomes used inappropriately, then that precludes others from using it
Right.
because of the behavior that's going on there.
I
So they
just-
will avoid it.
I'm just struck with, on the first item, while it says that, urination, public urination, public defecation are criminal offenses, it's rare and impractical for an officer to be present at the
Yep.
time the offense occurs or to be able to respond immediately. So I'm looking at that as a time and enforcement issue. But then for the restrooms 24/7, we come right back to the time and enforcement issue. So again, I'm just thinking about that. We have been
Lieutenant
awfully
Upke's
silent.
here, who has been involved in this type of enforcement with our Arta Potties downtown, and I don't know, maybe you can shed some light on what you've encountered.
Yeah, so looking at time and enforcement issues, with the Arta Potty in particular, we had issues where many of them were, I believe, set on fire. There was drug use, prostitution, and sleeping overnight in those as well, to the point where other people that would have utilized them were not utilizing them. I think eventually the program kind of tapered off because the actual providers of the porta potties refused to continue to operate them and took them back and just said, we don't want to participate in this program anymore.
So I know SEPTED, follow up. I know SEPTED is part of the criminal crime prevention through environmental design, the SEPTED.
Yeah.
So we've talked about staffing the restrooms. What about having them in sort of a quasi-busy area or an area where there's already a lot of people congregating? Would that lessen the staffing impact for enforcement, or is there any research or study on that? Having a public restroom where there's lots of cross-traffic?
I do think that the siting does make a difference, and I think that the design does make a difference. I think that was the whole genesis of the Portland Loo, easy to maintain and private, but not completely private. So you could see kind of what's going on or how long people are in there.
You mentioned Portland Loo. Is that something you're entertaining for downtown?
That option is included. Yep.
One thing with
Counselor
the,
Anderson.
sorry.
Go ahead.
With the enforcement issue as well that comes up. So if we were to open the Marion Square, or the Marion Square Park bathroom 24/7, currently now that does have a time when the park is closed that we can have enforcement action and prohibit overnight camping and things of that nature. If it's open, that creates another enforcement issue for us, that the restroom may be open, but the rest of the park can't be used. So accessing it becomes difficult for us to be able to police, the reason for people being in the park at all hours of the night.
I was thinking the same thing as far as when the shops are closed, when you're downtown, who's left downtown that needs to use the restroom, but they're public places that people are still there, and how do we balance this? So.
Yeah, so implementation option number 4 is the Portland Loo type of a facility. Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm interested in implementation number 3, and I'm glad to see Lieutenant Upke's here because We've discussed that. I was at some of the meetings and also discussed that. I mean, you're going to have somebody at the police station 24/7, and I've looked at the preliminary designs, and it seems like you could make it to access the public restrooms. You'd have to come through the front entryway, which should be some sort of monitoring and control, and I presume that you also might have something on the back end. So if you would not, two people going in, you might not allow that, and also after a certain period of time, you know, the doors would spring open or something would happen. So I'm wondering if the lieutenant could talk about the feasibility of that.
Yeah, so one, I'm not fully versed on exactly the mechanism of the restrooms in the facility. It's rather large.
That's
but
not your first area of interest?
Yeah, I get, I'm on the locker room committee, so part of it is, yeah. But basically, I think the way it's going to be is that there's going to be an entryway that has secure doors on either side, so one can go to kind of the community room, and I believe that's where the restrooms would be. So as you walk in, to the left would be to the restrooms in that area. To the right would be the business counter and records. I think right now, as far as controlling access, would be if someone comes in, they would have an intercom to request the record staff, which would be staffed on the bottom floor, and they would then request what they needed to do to go to the restroom, and so then they would be buzzed in over to the left of the public area.
Thank you, and I think that, you know, I thank the staff very much for your discussion of the fact that you can, I suppose this is a poor analogy, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't, you know, you can't make them do what they need to do where they do it. And a lot of this is because the mental illness problems that you could have a bathroom on every corner and people aren't going to use it. And that's a tough problem, and it's a problem that is much larger than what we can do in Salem. So I appreciate the fact that no matter what we do, there's still going to be a problem of this type downtown, as long as there are unfortunate people who are downtown.
Councilor Kaser?
I'm not sure if we want to talk about these like one at a time and kind of then move on. I don't know
Well,
the right.
Let's stick with the restroom
Okay.
for just a minute. If we're done,
Yeah.
we can move to the next
So
item.
a couple comments. Like, well, you haven't gotten through the rest of the implementation, I guess.
So
yet.
the last item on the restroom was the Portland Loo option, yeah.
So I guess my thoughts on it are this: is restrooms downtown. You know, it seems like we need restrooms for. You know, we have a population of people who are experiencing homeless. They largely congregate around the Marion Square Park arches, you know, those community providers, UGM. To me, it makes the most sense as far as access and then, you know, looking at our finances that we partner with somebody like Arches to be able to provide that 24/7, you know, staffed restroom. And also looking forward to the new police facility because it's basically in the same area of the city. And we're going to have already staff there, I think, 24 hours a day, and there's a community area, and it's going to be separate. So I think we could probably tackle a couple of these without actually like constructing facilities. I think there is, you know, Lieutenant Upkeys, like you said, there's kind of a disconnect between let's leave Marion Square Park restroom open 24/7, yet people are supposed to be at the park 24/7. So it's kind of this, it sends mixed signals, I guess, about the appropriate use of that space. The Portland Loo, I mean, I would love to see that one day. It's expensive. And I think it's just one of those things we have to consider is like, we could use urban renewal dollars to construct those, but then it's $20,000 a year to maintain it. And we could probably get there, but it's gonna be more difficult and it's longer term. I mean, it's 1 to 2 years, and some of these others we can implement in as soon as 6 months. So I'm looking at possibly there's some low-hanging fruit. Maybe there's also some longer term solutions here too. So I think they're all valid in their own way. It's just prioritizing which ones we want to tackle first.
Okay. Shall we move on then to our next area?
Yes, if we've got discussion completed on that one. Okay.
Did you want to say something?
I did. I just, I wanted to say with Counselor Kaiser's analysis of the restroom issue, I agree. I would just want to be mindful that the homeless population is not the only population, the houseless population is not the only population using park facilities, and that restrooms continue to become an issue for everyone, whether local residents or regional residents that are using our park. As we continue to improve those facilities, they become a draw. So again, just like with the bulb outs, if we're constructing restrooms, but those restrooms are going to have to be locked at night because they present issues, and we have the option of creating a private sort of, eliminate some of these other hazards, option like the Portland Loo, that's local. I would encourage us to just pursue it and not be, not at least try and get a good deal. They're local, they're from this region, and we have a unique issue and a unique opportunity. So I see this particular option of construction being a good way to make sure that we're incorporating that design and improving access for everybody.
Yeah, we'll have an opportunity to talk about this issue really in detail at time we look at the budget, I think. But you make a good point, and one you want to save, I think, for the budget. Go ahead then on to the next
All right.
topic.
The second one is more an operational and communication recommendation, and that is to establish a simplified point of contact for individuals to call for support when they're dealing with issues related to homelessness, and provide the community with guidelines on when to call 911 or the non-emergency number. So option number one is that a partnership with Northwest Human Services that has put into place a system called iCarol, and promote that as the go-to resource. The county had also been exploring a similar program, but I understand just in the last week or so that a decision has been made to not move forward with their system and instead support the iCarol system. So that is information that that when that partnership is in place with Northwest Human Services, that's the information that we could start pushing out, that this is the contact, and share that with our businesses and residents downtown.
So this would replace,
There really hasn't been anything. What we've had is this a piece of paper that has had dozens and dozens
It's a
of
resource.
lists and numbers. Right.
Okay.
It's a resource.
Okay,
So
I'm
instead
sorry.
of this a flyer that's never kept up to date and is really hard to navigate, that would just be one number that we could share with everybody. That this is
so
what
I
you're
have
calling
this,
to.
I'm a storekeeper Y, I have this issue going on in front, I call that number and,
So if you, it wouldn't be so much for the storekeeper that has an issue, but if there is perhaps an individual that has been camping in front of their business and they want to try to connect that person to a resource.
Got it.
Or if I myself am the person that is experiencing homelessness as another kind of connection, or
Okay.
that other resources could go to.
great. Okay, Counselor Hoy?
Thank you. Doesn't 211 cover that service?
So 211 is what we've had in the past, but that's the kind of the sheet that has been handed out that has just scads of names and resources. So iCarol is a little bit more streamlined than the 211, as far as my understanding of it.
So I have this problem, I call iCarol,
So-
and they can connect me to the appropriate resource, is that the concept?
That's my, and yes, that's the conduit.
It'd be
If
interesting.
you're calling in
when
and you
we-
want
when we
information.
Start working on these, if it comes to the budget committees, have someone here who can take us through
So
the mechanism.
This one really wouldn't be a budgetary issue
It
for
wouldn't.
us, no.
Okay, it's just we're in or we're out.
This one, when I mentioned that it's sort of operational and communication, so the request from Northwest Human Services was that they would like us to establish, and they're not the only, so I shouldn't say them, but there is an interest in the community on behalf of most of our service partners that we establish some ongoing structure to continue the dialogue that was started on this task force between service providers and businesses and city staff and county staff.
Okay.
and Northwest Human Services, their particular interest is they have the system, but they don't want that just being pushed out there in absence of this ongoing collaboration and relationship.
Counselor Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm looking at, under Roman numeral 2, on page 4, you talk about the county, and that's kind of, that's just, I don't know where it fits in all this, but social services, healthcare, as you say, that's typically been a role of county governments. And that ought to be the role of Marion County here. So I'm curious as to, is Marion County doing its job? And how we as the city can coordinate with the county, because the social services, the healthcare is not traditionally responsibility of the city. And you mentioned that here. You say, gee, if we start going down that road, we may be the only people who are doing it. So has there been contact with the county, and what are we doing with county mental health and county social services, which is their bailiwick?
So some of that coordination and the county's effort is through the regional work on homelessness, and that's centered through the COG. Okay, so our interface with them has largely been through that forum and the steering committee that's housed with the COG, and the position that we're partially funding with the COG. So what we're talking about here is really focused on the downtown and not broader homelessness. So, we're looking at solutions tied to our downtown, which in terms of the county's interest or county's role, it's sort of a yes and no. Yes, we're within the county and these are services they provide, but we're focusing on a very localized area here. And so could they be more engaged in our downtown? I think that, it would be reasonable to want them and ask them to be at the table if there were some ongoing organizational structure, that may be met quarterly to discuss these issues. I think it would be reasonable to want the county at that table. Whether or not they own that structure is a different question in terms of where it really belongs.
Well, is the county at the table?
They were not at the table as far as the task force. They
Okay.
are at the table for broader regional discussions on homelessness.
And I see the lieutenant's nodding his head, so maybe you've had discussions with the sheriff's department?
Not necessarily with the sheriff's department, but with the
Mental
Department
health
of
people,
Health and
county.
Human Services.
Okay.
So we already have established partnerships that we use and coordinate with on those levels.
Because from the county level, it doesn't seem to make much difference to me is there's somebody in Marion County who needs social service and needs social help, whether that's in Almsville or in Salem or in the country. They're still in the county, and the county provides social services. So, I would hope that they're the people that have the mental health officers and the people who deal with that. So I would hope that they could get into the picture here a little more.
Counselor Lewis?
Yeah, just a comment, putting aside who's responsible. One of the things that I recall from the task force was the business is continuing saying, we would like to be able to help, but we really don't know where to go, we don't know who to call. This, to me, is one of the most important aspects of the recommendations. To have that single point where it's simple for the business owner to say, here, call this number. And we heard that over and over and over again. The business owners seem to really want to help, but they were in the dark about as far as how to do it. This will help that.
Okay.
So the second piece under this item is to develop communication materials, share with the downtown businesses and the broader community that guidance on 911 versus the non-emergency. That is drafted, kind of what's holding that up is this sort of iCarol piece, and needing to know whether or not we're going to be establishing an ongoing partnership.
Do we need to act at some point then?
At some point, I think we'll need to determine whether or
bring it
not
to
we're
the
going to
council, or-
convene convene some sort of ongoing either task force or committee or something that can continue to kind of vet these sorts of issues.
Will this element go through the council?
So, because we've got different parts of this. So there will be budgetary requests that
For
will
the
come back
iCare,
through council, but.
for this element, will
So
it-
the request to establish some sort of structure would require council direction.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Well, we'll have a chance then, I think,
Yeah.
to, and I think you can hear who we'd like to have at the table or in the,
The county.
yeah.
And then the third, it kind of falls under the same category. It's encouraging and facilitate the ongoing dialogue between police, city staff, social service providers, and businesses. So some of these recommendations kind of overlap each other, so that's just a continuation of that same theme. So moving on to recommendation number 3, and that is to establish a good neighbor partnership for those that are involved downtown. And in conjunction with that partnership, then any revisions to ordinances or codes or any potential future discussions about camping ordinances, anything like that, then would be discussed through that venue. So the discussion around this item was that there are some individuals on the task force that were interested in addressing this issue through codes and ordinances. There were others that felt that moving down that path in absence of the relationship building side of things didn't make any sense. So to not spend time discussing, I'll use sit-lie as an example, to not move forward with something like sit-lie without having the relationship side of things in place and the collaboration there first to kind of talk through issues like this.
Then how does this get convened? How will that happen?
So I see all of this under one potential structure that brings together, I'll use our downtown advisory board as an example, okay, where it's, a board or commission of some type or task force or whatever that probably not a task force, but something ongoing that meets perhaps quarterly, that brings service providers, the county, businesses, property owners, and the city together, on a regular basis to talk about, what they're doing, how we can work more systematically and more strategically, and is then sort of a sounding board for different ideas and approaches and solutions.
Okay. Yes, Councilor Kaiser.
I just want to add that I think this is also one of the most important recommendations to come out of the task force, and that's, similar to what Councilor Luce was talking about. It's people wanted to continue the conversation, after the task force was done. So I think one of the things that came up was who owns it,
Right.
And that's still kind of a question mark. And then if the city owns it, do we have capacity to run that? Do we run the risk of now being the social service provider and all that kind of stuff? But I do think we need we'll have to figure it out because it is so important, and there was so much willingness to continue that conversation, so.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that we talked about is that there's a lot of isolation. The businesses aren't talking with service providers. Service providers aren't necessarily talking with each other. There's not regular communication between all the different parties on addressing a really big, complicated issue.
Well, I'll look forward to your recommendation then on how to convene it, because I think Councilor Kaiser's kind of describing the problem, but it does have, you can feel it as a place where you can talk about and at least find out what's going on besides our email or online, where we can actually hear from people and get some accurate description of where people have questions. I mean, we're constantly asked, why aren't you just enforcing your vagrancy law? What vagrancy law? That kind of stuff, I think, would be just having a place to bring those issues, whether we bring them or business owner or a homeless person or anyone else to get to a point of understanding what we can and can't do. I really like this too. I view it as really important place to clarify some of these issues for us. Yeah.
I think as well, since the conclusion of the task force, I think that the ongoing communication amongst these groups has continued to grow organically, and I've seen that on the street, that things have gotten better amongst all the different groups in communicating. So I do believe the desire is still there, but I also think that outside of a formal structure, that everyone's taken upon themselves to communicate in a much better way.
Great. Thank you.
So some of the implementation options under this recommendation were, one of them was to look at behavioral policies, kind of codes of conduct that UGM and some of the other service providers are put into place. Upon discussing that further internally, staff is not recommending that. And that goes back to expectations, that if you establish a code of conduct, the community, downtown community, then expects compliance with that, but there's no way that we could enforce it. So,
Do we use, the police used to have that exclusion? Is that used?
Yes, it is used,
It is used, okay.
but it's for enumerated offenses only, so they have to actually commit
So
the
it's like
crime.
drunkenness or,
No, well, there's no law against drunkenness in public, so there's nothing we can
okay.
exclude for that.
What then can you
So
have to do?
things
What,
like
if you
disorderly
defecate?
conduct, urination, defecation in public, things like that would exclude somebody from downtown for up to 30 days.
Okay. How many people are under that right now? I mean, how many people have been excluded lately?
I really couldn't tell you.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'd be
we can
interested at
generate
some point,
that, but you know, I just don't know off the top of my
Okay.
head.
Okay.
And we do provide exceptions to that. So if people need to receive services
Right.
within the downtown area, then we do of course grant them permission to do that too.
Okay. Okay.
so then the next one is another sort of overlapping one, and that is developing another kind of card and flyer for business owners to be able to share with individuals who are homeless, to give them information on alternatives.
Yes, sorry.
This is not on this one in specifically, but also others in general. And I see there's a lot of where you point out the risk in many of these options. The risk is there's a potential to increase confusion if partnerships are not in place and if the messaging is not clearly constructed. And I take it from what Lieutenant Upkees is saying that we're starting to get the partnership because a lot of these suggestions, that's the only risk, is that it's going to fall apart because
Right.
there's going to be a mixed message.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you're focusing on that.
It's that risk, or providing incorrect information. If you don't have the partnership and you're not continuing to have current and correct information, and then you're providing somebody bad information, then that's just going to aggravate the situation.
Yeah. Good.
Then the next one is revising Salem's ordinances to provide restrictions on camping or storing personal items on downtown sidewalks during business hours. There was not consensus at all about this recommendation. So I'd say the group was pretty divided on this one. I think if we do look at future code changes, again, the recommendation would be that it would be through that kind of partnership, or kind of vetting it through whatever sort of commission or partnership it gets established. The next one would be requiring site cleanup by campers who camp overnight on downtown sidewalks. And this is another one that staff is not recommending, again, just due to the inability to enforce it. Okay, so recommendation number 4, we're getting halfway there. Pursue options for expanding the downtown cleaning services. And so there are a few ways that we're looking at implementing this. One would be looking at a dignity to work model, and that I think Albuquerque and some other cities have done, and partner with service providers on that to either through grant funding, it'd likely be through grant funding, be able to employ individuals who are homeless and have them, through that grant program, add capacity to our cleaning services, and then also provide some work experience. Another option would be mentorship opportunities and partnerships, and so encourage the businesses, if they have individuals who are camping in front of their businesses, to maybe mentor or work more closely with those individuals. The third one is also tied to cleanliness, and that is having adequate trash receptacles, enough of them, having maybe increasing the frequency of removing trash. This one, I see is kind of tied to streetscape as we revisit our furnishings, making sure we're getting the right kinds of receptacles that aren't as easy to maybe get into. Like, if you're downtown in the morning, lots of times you'll see that these containers are opened up and the trash containers are pulled out as people have gone through them overnight, and then there'll be piles of trash around them. So this one I would recommend deferring until we get into furnishings with the streetscape project and address it through that.
I was also pleased to see hazardous disposal as well included on this for health and safety, so thank you.
Just another comment from Corvallis. What they did is they had a design party contest, and for street garbage cans, and they had planters on top, and they were locked, so you couldn't get into them, and they didn't look like a garbage can, they looked like a planter.
Recommendation number 5 is one I know the mayor's interested in, and that's developing additional storage. And so we've got a couple of different options there, and that one would be to, again, partner with the service provider and perhaps co-locate storage and maybe fund the construction of that storage using urban renewal. Another one would be to look at city location, city property, and establish storage in city, somewhere on city property in the downtown area. Another thing that's come up recently that's not included here, and this is something that's just come up in the last couple of days, is bike lockers. That we have increasing use of our bike lockers throughout our parks and in parking garages that is being used to store items. Possessions of homeless individuals. So the question was raised here just in the last day or two, do we look at that as a storage option, or do we look at eliminating the bike lockers, or, kind of, there's another potential opportunity or something that we need to address, because if they're being used for storage, then they're not available for people with bikes. But is that maybe in addition to bike lockers, is there an opportunity to use that kind of facility for storage? So another thing that we can explore.
Go ahead.
I joined the mayor in this. That's been one of the thing that I think is quite important. And the mayor and I had a conversation earlier this evening about that if these are in fact in order, and the first 4 seem to be kind of interconnected, but this one certainly seems to be one that we could do something about it. It might, if utilized again, we have the same problem of you can provide them and they may not use them, like with the restroom facilities, but I think this would be quite helpful to get people's possessions in a secure place so they don't have to worry about, I'm going to have my stuff wherever I go with my garbage cart. Or not grocery cart, not garbage cart.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when you're dealing with a situation where all of a person's possessions are generally in a single cart and backpack, that we should be able to help them accommodate that. To me, just thinking back on when this sort of sense of explosion of homelessness really occurred, it was virtually the day after UGM removed their lockers and closed those off where people were storing possessions. And I think that's one of the stigmas for people is to be having to push a cart around. It just strikes me as something we can do and that we need to find space. But I've been concerned about this for a couple of years, so I'm glad that it arrived on this list because it really caught my attention.
There are models also where it's volunteer staff to check in
Sure.
and check out. So, there are a few different ways to approach that. It's
And I
primarily
think we
finding
have
the-
a large community that's very interested in volunteer opportunities, and I think this is one of those that just, every once in a while, you'd like to make life a little bit easier for people, and this one would be one of those that you're not stuck with trying to both haul it around and protect it and, keep it dry and all the other things that confront people when they're in this situation.
Number 6 is providing a hygiene center with showers and laundry facilities. Again, partnership would be key in this one. Looking at partnering with a service provider that has, those sorts of facilities. And helping to subsidize operations to keep those available and open on weekends or for extended hours. Providing grant funds to service providers to operate shower and restroom facilities citywide. If we wanted to look at getting out of the downtown, we could look at, so we're in the middle of or just starting the grant cycle right now for our federal programs and the city's $400,000 general fund that goes to grants. So that's already been advertised. We're receiving applications, but in a future year, if we chose to, we could set aside some of that money to support that type of activity. Then item 8 is supporting alternate ways of giving, and one of the recommendations was reinvigorating the Give Hope Not Help campaign and educating the public on alternate ways of giving. Another one would be to repurpose coin parking meters and locate them throughout the downtown. That one, that one has some challenges in the collecting coins, processing coins. All of that is very time consuming, and it takes a lot of staff time to do that. I think there are other ways that we could encourage giving that would be more efficient, I think.
I thought that the parking funds go into the general fund as a.
No.
This would be
wouldn't-
donations, so
So
this would
this
be
is just the
taking-
old-fashioned meters, not the
Right,
card
yes.
readers?
This would be taking old-fashioned meters.
So
and
this
maybe
isn't
painting
free
them-
parking, we're doing the parking?
No.
Okay.
This would be, taking old meters, maybe painting them a different color and signing them. Could make a donation here. But you get into, meter maintenance and coin collection, and it can just take a lot of staff time. So it's probably not the best from an operational perspective. Then another option, and this could involve partnership with the Chamber of Commerce or maybe Main Street and our downtown businesses, would be establish a text to donate program. The way this works in Salem, Massachusetts is if you text in your donation, and maybe this is through an organization like United Way or something, you text in your donation, and from that text, you can go to a participating business and get, 20% off of your dinner or something that day. So if you show it the day that you make the donation. So, there's a potential partnership between service providers and downtown businesses on something like that. Then 8B, this goes back to the grant that you'll be seeing at your next meeting, and that's to encourage property owners to make building and site modifications to help with their site security and, address issues like access to dumpsters, lighting around their building, security cameras. A lot of our downtown buildings, have the little alcoves at the front, if they're, or even off the back in their alley, ways to increase security there.
Would that be done in conjunction with the streetscape I mean, would it be part of the planning for that, or would you?
We're looking at this as a separate grant program that would be a no-match grant. And so rather than us.
I'm thinking more in design and functionality in terms of how it would fit with the rest of the look of our,
A lot of these improvements we're thinking would actually, a lot of them would be off of the alley,
Okay.
where we tend to see more issues.
okay. Okay.
And also because of the streetscape issue, a lot of these are building improvements, not really sidewalk kind of improvements. So it would be lights on your building, security cameras on your building. If you have dumpsters off the alley, ways to better secure those.
Counselor?
Thank you. So just a question about the SEPTED. And what comes to mind is the spikes on the floor. And also looking at the streetscaping that we just talked about with the public space, the space for the business, the private space, trying to see that if there were any recommendations, what might happen, because the behavior you might attempt to discourage might actually be discouraging or hurtful to a wide variety of people if you're in a public space, and how that might change. Is that making sense? Am I going to see spikes everywhere?
No.
I
We're not
won't have a
talking about
place-
spikes. No,
Okay.
No.
So,
No, we're talking about improvements that a building owner could make to his or her property to, maybe establish better lighting. If there are issues, at the back of their building off the alley, where if they could improve their lighting, maybe have security cameras, or if they have dumpsters that people keep getting into, if, fund maybe building an enclosure around the dumpster to increase security.
I think, and the streetscapes bring this up, we're in a really unique situation being close to the Capitol and having the Capitol building so close. We do have marches, we do have events, and Salem PD is always there to help make sure things are under control, but just making sure that we're still keeping that welcoming and safe environment for people, and not necessarily inadvertently creating a hostile environment in our public places.
Yeah,
So-
no, we're not talking like razor wire fencing around.
I haven't seen the razor wire yet, but I've seen the spikes, so.
Counselor Lewis?
Yeah, again, on page 11, under number 3, the risk, there's a potential to increase confusion if partnerships aren't in place. And we see that over and over again, as Counselor Anderson pointed out. My question is, that to me now jumps out as a priority to get these partnerships solidified. Is there a time frame on, or a guess on when that could be done?
So I think that's really going to come down to, first of all, whether or not the city as an organization wants to take on that ownership role of the partnership, or not. So if it's not the city, then I couldn't tell you how long it might take for that sort of partnership to form. If it is something that the city chooses to take on, then it could be much more timely.
Counselor Kaiser?
Well, since this is a work session, I would love to actually have a brief discussion about that, because that's the issue I keep coming back to is who's the owner of all this stuff? And it's something we haven't, there's not a clear answer. In some ways, I feel like the city should be the owner because it's happening in our city. On the other hand, it creates a lot of overhead for us in terms of, can we actually do that financially and provide, can we do it well, I guess? And does that put onto us more of a role of a social service provider that we don't necessarily want? But it's a question that's going to have to be answered, or really most of this is not going to be able to be done if we can't answer that question. So, because I see a lot of things feeding into that group, that good neighbor part, whatever it would be called. But a lot of these things would be considered by that group, pushed by that group, helped to be, financed possibly through that group. But that is one of the lingering, unresolved things that I feel to move forward we're going to have to just make a decision about. And not tonight, obviously, but at least to have the conversation and really seriously consider if that is our role as a city.
Counselor?
Thank you. So coming out of the task force, I think, Councilor Kaiser, I really appreciate this work, and also second what you're saying, because what I'm looking at is the neutrality of it. It is happening in our city, but by allowing, or by taking that step back, who's going to step forward to fill that? And if there's going to be interests that can be neutral, if they're the same providers that are dealing with those services, how we can help create some equity at the table for the service providers and for the people using those services. Would this be appropriate for an additional board or an additional commission convening those partners? And maybe would that lessen the staff workload, or would that be appropriate? I think those are some questions that I would be interested in hearing some of the answers to, if that's an option, or what that process would look like.
Well, our traditional role has been to allocate $400,000 and allocate it to the various groups dealing with those priority issues that we identify. We've changed off of, in social services, economic development, which was the goal for the past, whatever, 4, 5, 6 years, to homelessness. And we certainly can look at that fund as, but you also along the way begin to excite other organizations who deal, I think everyone with, to some extent with homelessness, but they deal with other issues that we also support, and finding that balance, and particularly in a time of reasonably scarce resources. And I think that it'll be interesting as you see what kind of applications you get for your social service fund and how you recommend allocating it. It may be that there's a missing element there, and we can see it in the budget, but it still feels like a budgetary issue. Social services can be wildly expensive, just wildly expensive, depending on how deep you want to go in. And once you're in, you're in. Pretty, you can go in quite a ways, and you want to do it right if you're going to take this on. So I really think this will be part of our budget discussion, particularly after we see the kind of requests for allocation of the resources we have. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah,
If I may, I think certainly we can view it through a budgetary lens as should be. I think there's also, though, the important consideration of specificity in what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think there's, for example, a discussion that council should have regarding, is it ownership or is it convening? I think there's also a question of council's role. Perhaps an approach would be a group that's convened by the city manager or the urban development director when there are specific initiatives that require attention and more vetting before they're ready for city council or the county commission or the nonprofit boards. Certainly considerations regarding the the ongoing role of the city and the ongoing role of city council. So I think we should come back with some options that I think could help council discuss those, and certainly those options, the options that have budgetary considerations, we can have ready for the upcoming budget year. But I think there's some additional information that we can provide to you prior to the budget considerations on these these policy and the role of the city issues.
That's really good advice. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Powers. Yeah, Councilman.
Just to add, when I was going through this process all last year and just kind of thinking about it over the last few months, I've always felt like the role of the city is more of convener, facilitator, than it is actually like we're going to own it and make all the decisions about it and all that entails. And having more of I think what you're saying, Mr. Manager, is like an ad hoc group that's meeting as things come up to make some decisions about it. And that might be a good starting point. It's kind of one of those things like, what does the city do best? Does the city do social services the best? I would argue no. We do them okay. It depends on what it is. So there's that, the saying, do what you do best and network the rest, right? And we should be looking towards those places that are doing that all the time. They know the business. So, but yeah, anyways.
Okay, great. just really excellent information, lots to think about. Okay, is there any other discussion? Okay, then we're adjourned.